I'd like to start by giving a huge thanks to Ellie for her fantastic introduction to the malting complex at Sedgeford, and to warmly welcome you to my presentation today on the subject of malting, brewing and beer in Mid Anglo-Saxon Sedgeford and beyond, entitled with a quotation from Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale, "For a quart of ale is a dish for a king." I'll begin by putting the Anglo-Saxon malting complex at Sedgeford into something of its historical context. I'll then look more broadly at the role of beer and brewing in Anglo-Saxon society, before concentrating particularly on charred plant remains from the malting complex, and then closing by putting Sedgeford's malt into something of its socio-political context. Now, this is not a king, however, he was almost certainly drinking beer. This figure from an early medieval calendar from St. Albans is holding a drinking horn and bowl, which, if he were a real person, almost certainly one of which would have contained beer. We'll come back to him. Now, this conference focuses on Sedgeford in the Mid-Saxon period, which is also known as the Long 8th Century and is commonly dated to 650 to 850 AD. This era is recognised to have been a time of great transformation in the lives of the Anglo-Saxon people, with socio-political changes, including the emergence of kingdoms, kings and lordship, and also the ecclesiastical elites or monasteries. In terms of settlement structure, proto-urban trading emporia were established on the North Sea and English Channel coasts, and inland market settlements, now sometimes known as productive sites, are believed to have emerged. In terms of rural settlements, these arguably shifted across the landscape, as argued by Hannah Caroe and others, and became newly good planned, as John may talk about later, and nucleated in this time. In terms of agriculture, the scale of change was such that it has been termed a revolution. There was a shift away from post-Roman subsistence agriculture, and also a shift away from pastoralism towards arable farming known as cerealization. There was expansion of the area under cultivation, including novel cultivation of heavy clay soils, which would have required the use of a mob-bore plough, as illustrated in the background here, and also an increase in overall productivity, including the accumulation of surpluses, which we believe may have been exchanged long distance. Finally, three-field crop rotation and open field farming have their beginnings in this time. Let's return to everyone's subject, beer. Of course, there are two main sources of information for understanding the role of brewing and beer in Anglo-Saxon society. Firstly, literature from the period helpfully available in its historical period, and secondly, archaeological evidence. We'll begin by looking at some of the documentary evidence. Why do I claim that the gentleman from the St. Albans calendar was drinking beer? Well, quite simply, Anglo-Saxons drank vast amounts of this stuff. It was a staple part of their diet and hugely symbolically significant. There are multiple references in fiction, in the fictional account Beowulf, to the retainers of Hrothgar and others being drunken. And it's known that secular elites regularly gave lavish feasts at which ample quantities of beer were provided, and these were incredibly important for retaining tenants and other members of retinue, retaining their loyalty. And one Irish mythological text dismisses a king because guests left a feast at his house without the smell of beer on their breath. It certainly seems that this was, as Weber writes of another period, a time when those who could gorged themselves and those who couldn't aimed to. What do we know about beer in the church? Well, multiple edicts were issued to control drunkenness amongst people of the cloth in this period. And here we have Bede referring disparagingly to even our Lord's own flock and its pastors giving themselves over to drunkenness and other such sins. The punishment for throwing up at the communion rail through drunkenness was to do 60 days penance. I'll now just think briefly about the difference between ale or elu and beer or beer in Anglo-Saxon society. Ale and beer are used fairly synonymously today. However, in the Mid-Saxon period, these were very different drinks, with beer being stronger and drunk most often by elites, and elu being weaker and consumed by everyone, including children, as a safe alternative to water. Abbot Aelfric is recorded as asking his charge, Aelfric Barter, what he drinks, And Elfric Barth replies, ale if I have it, or water if I have no ale. Finally here, the quotation at the beginning of this talk refers to beer as a dish, and it was certainly considered a source of nutrition. One law text suggests the use of beer as an alternative to fruit and vegetables for invalids, and beer was particularly important as a source of nourishment in the winter when fruit and vegetables were more difficult to come by. Now, we've heard from Ellie quite a bit about the process of beer making, so I'll summarise this fairly quickly. But to understand the process of beer making in the Mid-Saxon period, it helps first perhaps to look at beer making as practiced today. All types of beer making involve, in addition to water, three main ingredients. Firstly, a starch source, almost always cereal grain. Secondly, a flavouring or preservative. And thirdly, yeast. And I'll describe the process of brewing briefly now. First of all, the grains, almost always 2-row hulled barley today, are steeped in water for several hours. This begins the process of germination. The grains are then turned or couched onto a germination floor, and germination continues. This involves the growth of a sprout and rootlets, and crucially, the release of key enzymes within the grain body or endosperm. Next, the grains are kilned or dried at about 50 degrees for several hours. As Ellie has said, this stops the process of germination without, crucially, denaturing any of the key enzymes. These are the 3 stages of malting. Thereafter, the grains are milled and mashed with warm water, at which stage the enzymes or diastase convert starch to sugars within the grains, within the collection of grains. Next, the grains or wort, as they're called at this stage, are boiled, at which stage hops, the most common flavouring or preservative used almost ubiquitously today, are added. And finally, the mixture is fermented with yeast, at which stage sugars are converted to alcohol. This is brewing as practiced today. I should say the picture's mostly from home brewing, but what do we know about brewing as practiced in the Anglo-Saxon period? Not as much as we would like is the answer. As Wendy Smith has said, traditional non-industrial methods of malting and brewing are not well documented, and even in the historical period, methods tend to be glossed over. However, one rare text, the Irish Census More, records brewing as follows. When the ale was to be prepared, the ground malt was made into a mash with water, which was fermented, boiled, strained, etc., till the process was finished. This sounds superficially quite similar to the description I've just given of modern beer making. However, there were key differences between the process of Mid-Saxon brewing and modern brewing in the 3 key ingredients I've mentioned in the previous slide. First of all, in terms of starch, modern brewing used predominantly 2-row hulled barley, whereas Mid-Saxon brewers would have used a wide range of cereals, including wheat, rye, and oats, sometimes growing these together as a maslin, and often certainly malting them and brewing them together. Next, modern brewing uses as a flavouring or preservative almost always hops. Now, it's controversial, but hops are believed to have been first used on the continent in the 9th century and not introduced to England until after this period. The flavouring and preservative used most often in the Mid-Saxon period was a mixture of herbs called gruit, whose main component was Marica gale or bog myrtle. However, a wide range of other potential additives were also used, including milk and even egg. With these additives and without hops, the beer certainly would have tasted very different. Finally, the role of yeast in brewing is well understood today. However, the Anglo-Saxon brewers would have known nothing about yeast. However, they might have known about the need to scrape or skim some of the foam from the surface of one fermentation and add it to the next. Alternatively, it has been suggested that fruit flies may have played a role in transferring yeast from one fermentation to the next. Now, in contrast to the dearth of evidence for brewing methods used in Anglo-Saxon England, we have an abundance of references to malt and beer being exchanged as rents and tributes. And we'll hear a lot more about this from Neil in just a moment, but here are just a couple of examples. And I should say many of these are from royal charters. King Ine ordered a tenant to pay 12 ambers of Welsh ale and 30 of clear ale. And Leofsig, Bishop of Worcester, paid annually 60 mitten of malt to the Abbey at St Albans. We've thought quite a bit about the evidence for beer and brewing and the importance and significance symbolically of malting, beer and brewing in the Anglo-Saxon period as evidence from documentary sources. However, I'll now begin to look at some of the archaeology for beer making and malting. It's from Sedgeford, excitingly. Now, we've heard a lot about this from Ellie, so I'll just glance through it. But excavation at the malting complex began because of the discovery of an anomaly on a magnetometry survey of the area. This, sorry, and the initial analysis led to the supposition that this was a cereal processing complex because of the density of charred grains across the site. Early archaeobotanical analysis of this site by Cambridge student Alice Wolfe led to the discovery of many germinated grains, which led to the plausible redefinition of the cereal processing complex as, in fact, a malting complex. Here we have an aerial photograph of the malting complex taken at the beginning of the 2019 season. And again, Ellie has talked through much of this. It's pretty exciting. We have at least 3 clear malting kilns with a 4th and perhaps even a 5th, as we've heard hypothesized. And also each of these, particularly each of the malting kilns 1, 2, and 3 has an associated clay floor or germination floor. There's a steeping system, and the large post holes around malting kiln 1 suggest that this housed a large-scale malt house. The inset photograph showed close-ups of the 3 malting kilns definitely identified to date. The abundance of ceramic ware at the site, as we've heard from John and from Ellie, is Ipswich ware, which dates the site quite fairly accurately to between 775 and 925 AD, which would make it the earliest known malting complex in Anglo-Saxon England, which is very exciting. And as we've heard, radiocarbon dating is currently taking place and should help us to clarify something of the story of the malt house in the Mid-Saxon period. Just to discuss this slightly more, here we have a map showing all of the sites I've identified from the Saxon and medieval periods where evidence for malting has been claimed. You will see that there are no early Saxon sites, so the only site roughly contemporaneous with Mid-Saxon Sedgeford is Heigham Ferrers in Northamptonshire, and that there are only 6 sites from the entire Saxon period where evidence of malting has been claimed, with the remainder being from the later medieval period. This highlights the uniqueness of Sedgeford. But just to discuss Heigham Ferrers for a moment, there is a wonderful so-called monumental malting kiln here. However, it is a single kiln, and Sedgeford, with its series or complex of kilns, is to date wholly unparalleled for this period. We'll now begin to look at something of my archaeobotanical analysis of the charred plant material from the malting complex. Here you can see samples that I've sorted from the trench, aggregated according to area. And the first thing to notice is that these are very grain rich, with over 75% grain in each combination of samples. Otherwise, the combinations of samples are very similar. However, kiln 1 has slightly lower proportion of chaff. It's also important to note that each of the aggregated collection of samples has 3% on average detached sprouts or coleoptiles. And these are a sign of germination and potentially of malting. Now, of course, germination can be caused by accidental wetting. However, this chart, which shows the relative proportions of detached sprouts relative to grain frequency in samples from across the site, suggests that sprouts are found broadly distributed across the site. And if accidental wetting was the cause of germination, we would expect the sprouts to be concentrated in one area. As Lisa Lodwick has suggested, the distribution of sprouts across the site, where there is broad distribution of evidence for germination across the site, this suggests large-scale malting. This pie chart shows the relative proportions of grains according to species in samples from across the malting complex. And you will see that almost 2/3 of all the grains are of rye. This is significant. Rye was almost unknown in the Romano-British era and remained a minor crop throughout the Anglo-Saxon period. And the Anglo-Saxons loved to rank everything. And a law text suggests that, and other sources suggest that rye is a prestigious cereal, second only to bread wheat in terms of its rank. And bread wheat is, of course, second most common grain at Sedgeford. We'll think a bit more about this in a moment. Now, this chart has a lot of information. It summarizes the proportions of the different cereal grains in each sample, which I've sorted to date. But all I really ask you to notice is that the samples from kiln 1 have a higher proportion of blue or free threshing wheat. This is perhaps more obvious in this chart, which shows that the samples from kiln 1 here in orange are about 50%, samples of kiln 1 are about 50% wheat here in orange. This chart shows the relative density of grains in samples from across the malting complex. And you can see the predominance and the concentration of grains in kilns 2 and 3 relative to kiln 1, which is slightly more grain poor. Again, there's a lot of information in this chart. However, it summarizes the abundances of the top 10 weeds which occur in the Sedgeford malting complex. But I'd just like to point out two things. Firstly, the diversity of many of the samples in terms of weed spectra. And secondly, the abundance of blue here corresponding to Fallopian convolvulus or black bindweed at kiln 1. This trend is more obvious here. This chart shows the relative abundance of black bindweed relative to grain frequency across the trench. And again, you can see the abundance of black bindweed at kiln 1. These next two charts are correspondence analyses. Don't worry, I won't go into too much detail, but essentially each point corresponds to a single sample, and the samples are color-coded by area of the trench. And where the samples occur closely together, this suggests that they have a similar composition. And this particular distribution represents the relative frequencies of the 4 main cereal taxa in samples from across the site. And you can see that most of the samples are fairly closely overlapping. However, kiln 1 in pale blue is more distinct. And this will be due to the relative concentration of wheat or free threshing wheat in these samples. The next chart shows the abundance of the distribution and abundance of not only the 4 cereal grains, but also the 12 most common cereal weed taxa in samples from across the site. And again, you can see that the points mostly overlap. However, kiln 1 is fairly distinct, and this will be due to the abundance of bread wheat, but also of black bindweed in these samples. So let's think for a moment more about black bindweed. This seed is one of the 3 most common at Sedgeford, along with bromus and Agrostemma githago, or corn cockle, and it is roughly the same size as cereal grains, which means it can only be removed from harvested material by hand sorting. Sorry about the telephone. So thinking about black bindweed, is known in some parts of the country as wild hops to this day. Interestingly, also, Japanese knotweed, a closely related species, is used in experimental or novelty beers increasingly in the current age. Also, Gillian Campbell, in her research at Late Saxon West Cotton, found 17 black bindweed seeds along with germinated grains, which she hypothesizes are a product of malting, in one sample from the site, whereas other samples without germinated grains contained a maximum of a single black bindweed seed. And finally, there is no evidence for black bindweed in samples from the settlement part of the site, which I have sorted. Is it remotely possible that Sedgeford's maltsters were deliberately adding, or perhaps more likely tolerating, black bindweed seeds in harvested material prior to malting because of known helpful properties for beer making? Well, next think about corn cockle, another seed which is a similar size to cereal grains, which has to be removed by hand sorting. Now, importantly, corn cockle is poisonous, and this must be the reason why Thomas Tusser, writing in his 500 Points of Good Husbandry, suggests that corn cockle, which is a very abundant seed at Sedgeford, should be the only seed to be removed from the harvested material before steeping. And he writes, "The seed go and cast it, for malting not so, they get out the cockle and then let it go." However, in a 1710 commentary on Tusser's work is written, "If the cockle be left in, it will work, and some say make the drink the stronger. And of cockle, malt him, he works with the barley." Also, in an 1810 commentary on this passage by William Mavor is written, "Cockle, indeed, is supposed to render beer more heady, though certainly less wholesome." Is it remotely possible again that Sedgeford's maltsters were adding, or perhaps more likely tolerating, corn cockle amongst the material being processed for malting, with the expectation and hopes of making a very potent beverage? We can continue to think about that. Finally, archaeobotanists often like to talk about crop processing. Now, each of the cereals processed at Sedgeford, the bread, wheat, rye, barley, and oats, is a so-called free threshing cereal, which refers to the way in which it needs to be prepared before being used for baking or storage, etc. Glynis Jones has produced a very clear summary of the sequence of processes required for processing grains for malting, free threshing grains, I should say. However, it's evidence to believe that processing of grains for malting would have been slightly different. Again, we have Wendy Smith letting us know that traditional methods of preparing grains for malting, as well as malting and brewing themselves, are difficult to find evidence for. However, I have found some references to the suggestion that maltsters in traditional periods would not have removed chaff and weed seeds from harvested material before steeping, because of the expectation that some of the weed seeds and chaff would be removed by skimming from the surface of the steeping tank where they would be floating. So William Mavor again writes, "In malting, casting is not necessary, as the light grains and seeds of weed may be skimmed off in the cistern." Similarly, Hertrich, writing in 2013, says, "On traditional malting, evidence was placed on cleaning barley in the steep by skimming chaff, light barley, and foreign seeds from the surface of the first fill of the steeping tank." Again, there's lots of information here. Essentially, this slide summarizes the stages of crop processing as deduced by Glynis Jones in 1984. However, crucially, I have added in here the two stages, which I suggest occur in beer making and which are distinctive. The skimming, as I said, but also I argue that there's a final stage necessary in processing material for beer making, which is subsequent to kilning, the sieving or rubbing of grains to remove the rootlets and sprouts, which are believed to taint the flavour of the beer. So let's summarise the results from my archaeobotanical analysis. First of all, we have detached sprouts across the trench, which is strong evidence that this is, in fact, a malting complex. Secondly, rye dominates, and we can question, with its high status, whether this speaks to the status of the Sedgeford malting complex. I should just add that it's possible that the abundance of rye at Sedgeford was an adaptation of local farmers to local environmental conditions and the sandy soils, which rye grows very well in. Thirdly, we've noticed that kiln 1 is distinct. It has a lower grain density, a higher proportion of wheat, an abundance of black bindweed, and very little chaff. I suggest that these distinctive features of kiln 1 imply a different agricultural and crop processing regime is taking place in processing harvested material for drying in kiln 1. And speaking to Ellie's questions about phasing of the different kilns, it is possible that kiln 1 was used at a different time to the other kilns, and it may have even burnt down a long period subsequent to its final use, such that the grains that remain are a residue. Next, we've looked at whether black bindweed and corn cockle could be deliberately used as beer ingredients by Sedgeford's maltsters, And finally, I've advanced a new model of crop processing. We'll now segue from looking at tiny burnt grains to looking at how they fit into the wider picture of Anglo-Saxon society. Neil will talk some more in just a moment about the way in which he believes Sedgeford is typical of many of the features of Anglo-Saxon, Mid Anglo-Saxon, I should say, society, which I described earlier on in this presentation. One of the ways in which this is the case is that the sheer size of the malting complex of Sedgeford suggests oversight by an elite. The discovery of styli and vessel glass in the trench are tantalizing suggestions of an elite presence here. And Davies has suggested from zooarchaeological evidence or animal bones at the site that there was a transition from ecclesiastical to secular elite oversight at Sedgeford during the Mid-Saxon period. Archaeobotanists like to think a lot about the distinction between producer sites, which, as the name might suggest, are sites where food and other raw materials are produced, to consumer sites, which are characterized by the consumption of material produced elsewhere. Using this distinction, Sedgeford could be classed as a producer site, capable of producing a surplus, in this case of malt, and I suggest perhaps that local farmers were centralizing their harvests at Sedgeford for malting. And this producer site at Sedgeford might have been in a trading network, I suggest, with consumer sites with which it was having an ongoing relationship. Now this chart, this map shows the distribution of Ipswich ware, which Neil will talk quite a lot more about, which is produced in Ipswich. And you can see here the importance of waterways for transport through the country, because Ipswich ware was clearly distributed around the coast and then inland by waterways. Transport by water was considerably cheaper than transport over land. And it's argued, as Neil will again talk about in a moment, that the river Heacham, which connected Sedgeford with the sea, was partly canalised in the Mid-Saxon period. And is it remotely possible that malt from Sedgeford was transported to the sea on the canalised river Heacham, around the coast to the productive site at Burnham potentially, and even to the emporium at Gipperswich or Ipswich? The discovery of a Frankish coin and a millstone from the continent suggests that Sedgeford does have international connections. It's very unlikely, but is it remotely possible that malt from Sedgeford was being exchanged internationally? These are the sort of questions I will continue to think about as my research goes on. However, it's clear that tiny burnt seeds have rich stories to tell. And I would hope to provide some more evidence for this hypothesis by looking for a moment in this final slide at the seed Anthemis cotula, or stinking mayweed. This occurs in 15% of samples from the site and is known as an indicator species because it preferably grows on heavy clay soils. As I've said, rural settlements shifted in the Mid-Saxon period, or many of them did, often from lighter, easily tillable soils onto sometimes heavier clay soils. These heavy soils would not be easily possible to till these heavy soils using a handheld wooden ard, which was the type of plough being used in the early Saxon period. Instead, a heavy moldbore plough would have been necessary. Mark McKerracher has argued that moldbore ploughs may have only been accessible to wealthier farmers. Certainly, if extensification in cultivation was taking place, and this is one of the arguments of the Oxford Feed Sacks group, this would have involved an expansion of the area of cultivation, expansion of productivity through expanding the area of cultivation without associated increases in labour or manure per unit area. And this would have certainly involved expansion onto heavier clay soils. To extrapolate from the presence of a single seed at Sedgeford, a single seed species, I should say, at Sedgeford, to suggesting that the local farmers were elite and that they were deliberately extensifying their cultivation is almost certainly a step too far, but you never know. Certainly, tiny seeds have rich stories to tell.